Welcome to Interesting People. My name is Tom Lorentzen, and I'm the host of the show. And this show is presented under the auspices of the Chabot Las Positas Community College District. The show, as we've referenced before, is based upon the fact that there are interesting people everywhere in everybody's family, community, and neighborhood. Today's guest is a person that's had one of the most distinguished careers in the history of American television journalism and has interviewed some of the most important people of our time and covered some of the most important stories of our time. So today the tables are turned and I'm interviewing my guest and good friend, Mr. Sander Vanocur. Welcome, Sander.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. And before we proceed further in discussing with Sander on his life and career and his in journalism, I'm going to provide you a little background on Sander's background, and we're going to talk about his early life, his education, and his entrance into the world of television journalism, and then his very distinguished career he's had for a long time in that world. This is going to be the first show, which is going to cover the period of time up until 1980. The second show will cover from 1980 forward. Mr. Vanocur was born in Cleveland and raised there in Peoria, Illinois during the Depression. He's a graduate of Northwestern University and attended the London School of Economics. He went to NBC News early in his career, where he was the White House correspondent and national political correspondent in the 1960s through 1971. He's also well known for having been a panelist for the first debate between Senator Kennedy and Vice President Nixon in 1960, with the first presidential debates held in the 20th century. And he also conducted one of the last interviews with Robert Kennedy before he was assassinated in 1968.
We were talking about bombing Hanoi, and we're concerned about that because we're going to kill civilians. Now we're killing large numbers of them as we bomb Saigon.
And covered it live that night throughout the entire evening from the Ambassador Hotel. After leaving NBC News, he went to PBS and the Washington Post and worked for them for several years. Then he went to ABC News in 1977 and worked there through 1991, where he served as chief diplomatic correspondent, senior correspondent in Buenos Aires, and was anchor for the first weekly business program, Business World. And he was chief correspondent for the 1980 and 1984 presidential elections. He also later covered the World Economic Summits in 1997, 98, and 1999. And he has done work with the History Channel, and he's also got a son who is an anchorman now with the news in Salt Lake City.
Boundaries, which is perhaps a new way of looking at the way political boundaries are drawn in Utah.
With that, Sander, welcome again to Interesting People, and let's start off by telling us a little bit about your early years, born in Cleveland and raised there in Peoria, and what was it like during those years growing up there?
Well, before I tell you, I think you ought to tell my wife that I'm interesting. I was born in Cleveland, 1928. My father was a lawyer, part of the Republican organization there, which was sort of connected to the period of Mark Hanna, who was part of the what we'll call the change in the Republican Party, Teddy Roosevelt and so forth. And I lived there the first 12 years of my life till my mother and father got divorced, and my mother took my sister and I off to Peoria, Illinois, where I had an aunt and uncle, and he owned a produce house. And I was sent off right before Pearl Harbor to Western Military Academy in Alton, Illinois, and got a great education there. And then I went to Northwestern University on a scholarship and got a wonderful education there.
And you majored in political science, as I understand.
I majored in political science because there was a wonderful professor there named Charles S. Heinemann. And his first book was on the Indiana legislature. And I figure, if I can understand a legislature, I can understand anything.
We could all use help in that area to try and understand that whole process. How did you end up going to London then after Northwestern?
Well, I was in Northwestern, and I'd go downtown occasionally, and there was a theater, and the first lecture I heard was a man named Arthur Koestler, the author. And I remember he pointed to the east and said, "The Soviet Union is not left, it is east." And then I went down some weeks later to hear a lecture by Harold Lasky, who was a very left-wing socialist, great political scientist, great friend of Felix Frankfurter, who sent a lot of people down to the New Deal. And indeed, when I later went to the army in Berlin, I read the correspondence between Lasky and Justice Holmes. But mostly I just wanted to go to London, though I had an offer to come to Berkeley, California. A man named Peter Odegaard, who went from being head of Reed College down to Berkeley, and he said, come to Berkeley for a year and then go to London. But I wanted to get to London. But I came out here because I'd finished all my courses in Evanston, and I had about 7 months, and I worked first in a logging camp in Bernie, California, and then I went down because there was going to be a strike, I thought, to Lake Tahoe, where I went to work at the inn there, the
Calneva?
Calneva Lodge. And I started as a busboy, advanced to a waiter, and then I became a shill. And a shill is somebody, you know, who plays,
I know what a shill is.
because people hate to start on a cold deck. And I worked 8:15 at night till 8:45 in the morning, and I got enough money to go to Europe, but I fell in love with California.
And that was pre-Frank Sinatra when you worked at the Calneva.
Yes, it was. I didn't really see him until Kennedy was on his way, as was Hubert Humphrey in '60, to Sacramento to speak to the Democratic Party. And JFK wanted to stop off in Las Vegas, which was just a wide place in the road in those days, because his brother-in-law, Peter Lawford, was playing at the Sands.
The Sands, yes.
And Sammy Davis Jr. and Dean Martin and Joey Bishop. And I remember Joey Bishop looking down at Kennedy and saying, "Senator, if you get elected president, don't draft me again."
Well, then when you went to London, now you attended the London School of Economics?
I attended the London School of Economics, and it was kind of a loose arrangement because unlike American higher education, you had a tutor, you didn't have to go to classes, though I did, and I fell in with a man named Martin White, W-I-G-H-T, who had been the London Observer's correspondent at the UN, which was a good post, and the Observer was then owned and run by David Astor of the Astor family.
Oh.
And one day, it was a Sunday, the Observer came out. On Monday, I went into Martin's office and said, that man who wrote that article saying, now that America has built up its army because of the war in Korea, it'll dominate the world. And I said, that's just not true. He said, why don't you write an article? Well, I wrote it. The next Sunday, it was in the paper. On Friday, I was invited to lunch at the Savoy. And I sat next to Arnold Toynbee's son, Philip.
Wow.
And when you see your name in a headline, it says, Sander Vanocur, graduate, Northwestern University, that kind of makes it. And then I was picked up by the North American Service of the BBC. But then I was drafted and I was sent over first to Austria and then to Berlin. I was in Army Intelligence. I spent 2 years on the continent, which was a great experience because the Cold War was really just getting underway.
Yes. How then, when was there any particular interest that you had at the time that you got curious about the world of journalism, and how did you start to enter that world?
I've been interested in journalism because when I was in Northwestern, I had to work my way through, and I was lucky. I had a job, but on Saturday afternoon, I would get home in time to listen to Toscanini and the NBC Symphony, because General Sarnoff, who ran NBC, had brought over Toscanini from fascist Italy. And then on Sunday, I'd listen to the CBS Symphony. In the Midwest was about 1 to 2. And the intermission featured a man named Howard K. Smith. one of Murrow's boys, as he was called. And I became entranced, and I wrote him a letter. And when I went to London, as I decided to do, Howard and his wife Benedictine, she was Danish, they practically adopted me, and I'd meet all these great people like Murrow and so forth. And I think I saw the first Don Hewitt show. He was the producer of 60 Minutes. And it opened up with a shot of New York Harbor, and then it switched to San Francisco. And that was hot stuff in those days.
Now, it appears in a way, we talk about Murrow and his boys, my best recollection is that they were sort of entered the world of journalism during in a, I won't say a haphazard, but an apprenticeship way. Seems like you were going in a way perhaps a little more academic and then went into the world of journalism. Is that a fair assessment?
I think that is a fair assessment. However, I think I envied them very much because they had gone right into journalism. And that was a very glowing light in the world of radio, and then television was just coming in. And then I got to know a lot of print people like Drew Middleton, who was the bureau chief in London for the New York Times, and then David Schomburn, who was the CBS correspondent in London, who first made me very suspicious about Western involvement in Vietnam.
Really?
Yeah.
What year was that?
That was in 1954, 55.
Mm-hmm. The Dien Bien Phu, was that?
Well, the Dien Bien Phu had occurred. They had the conference in Geneva, where John Foster Dulles, our Secretary of State, refused to shake hands with Zhou Enlai. But it made a great experience for me in terms of making me interested in European and then American presence in Vietnam, which I was opposed to.
Mm-hmm. Now, with the British Broadcasting Company there then, were they ahead of the TV journalism in the United States then? Were they more advanced at that time than we were?
Well, TV was invented in England, and I remember at the 1939 World's Fair in New York, they brought TV over, and E.B. White, the great essayist of the New Yorker, wrote an article and said that this has the capacity to become the Chautauqua of the West.
Oh,
Chautauqua,
sure,
those wonderful lectures in
yes.
upstate New York. But I think America promptly was ahead. On the other hand, it wasn't easy to buy a set. Usually in the 40s and 50s, well, the 50s really, you had one set in the house, and you'd watch the evening news. Radio was dominant. On Sunday night, it started with Eddie Cantor, and then you had ended with Fred Allen, and then came Walter Winchell, the most famous radio voice in America. So radio was dominant into, well, 48 was the first televised convention in Philadelphia, the Democratic Convention.
I accept the nomination.
So I think it was about even, but maybe America a little ahead.
Really? That's right. Tell us about some of the views that you had during that period of time as you were being birthed in the journalistic world in the 1950s. And about the 1950s, you know, there's stereotypes about the gray flannel suit, the Eisenhower period of time. There was a boring period of time in a lot of people's eyes. And what were your views during the 1950s as you were covering more and more of this country?
See, in the 1950s and a bit later, there were two stories that dominated the news. One was the Cold War.
Moscow is a city he hears of often. Names such as Khrushchev, Bulganin, and Zhukov have meaning.
And the second, after I got home, was civil rights. And those were what you'd call epic stories. And there was a 15-minute newscast, so they dominated the news. And it was the coverage of the Cold War that was really quite necessary at the time because of the brilliant airlift later and a bunch of other things that caught America's imagination and America's fright. But remember, growing up in the 30s, there was one voice that dominated radio, Franklin D. Roosevelt.
And we'll come back to that question there as we're going to take a brief pause here for an announcement.
I'm Colorado Attorney General John Suthers, a member of the National Association of Attorneys General. Every year, consumers just like you can fall victim to fraud and identity theft. A recurring scam involves fake lotteries. Victims are informed they've won a large lottery or sweepstakes. Fraudsters will then ask you to send money to cover taxes or a processing fee. Don't be fooled. Remember, you should never pay in advance to receive lottery or sweepstakes winnings.
With that, Sander, talking about one voice on the radio, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and the power of radio, and then as we were transitioning into the TV era, where TV then was becoming the dominant source beyond radio, tell us how you view on how FDR used the radio and his voice to provide leadership for the country during that period of time.
Well, it was a very dramatic voice, and he was not seen because there was no television, and he was a cripple.
My friends, I want to talk for a few minutes with the people of the United States about banking. To talk with the comparatively few who understand the mechanics of banking, but more particularly with the overwhelming majority of you who use banks for the making of deposits and the drawing of checks.
I didn't know Roosevelt was a cripple till 1936. My mother took me to see Roosevelt at Cleveland Auditorium, and he came in on the arm of Jimmy Roosevelt, his eldest son. And there was an unwritten law among photographers to not photograph him below the waist. Now, there was some notion that he had something because they started the March of Dimes, which was created to stop polio and so forth. But I don't think he said anything about it till he came back from Yalta, the Yalta Conference in 1944, and 45. And that was with Stalin and Churchill. And he addressed the Congress. And he apologized to the Congress for sitting down, and he made reference to the weight on his legs. And you filmed it. But that was the first reference. But the other part of him was what we saw, and the other part of it was absolutely so vibrant. And there's a famous story about Eleanor Roosevelt, his wife, who was a great figure in her own way.
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed in Paris in 1948 on December the 10th. We have fostered the observance of this day not only in the United States but throughout the world.
Was listening to his conversation with his Secretary of Interior, Harold Ickes, which lasted 15 minutes and was all but denunciation of another close aide, Harry Hopkins. All Roosevelt said was, "You're absolutely right." He leaves. In comes Hopkins and says the same thing about Ickes. All he says, "You're absolutely right." He leaves. Eleanor Roosevelt's been listening from the next room. She comes around and says, "Franklin, everything that Harold Ickes said about Harry Hopkins, it was terrible. And all you said was, you're absolutely right. Everything that Harry said about Harold, you said you're absolutely right. That's the most immoral thing I've ever heard." And he said, "Eleanor, you're absolutely right." He was really, in my lifetime, the most magical figure, whether in newsreels or on radio. And there was a line of his Secretary of Agriculture in the first two administrations, and then Vice President during the war. And Henry Wallace is supposed to have said, Roosevelt's genius is his ability to have everyone's balls in the air except his own.
Well put. And now, in the 1950s, too, you referenced with the Cold War and the Civil Rights Movement as being the key issues. And also then with radio and TV now starting to challenge and then, in a way, almost overwhelm radio in terms of that. But also with the presidents, Franklin Roosevelt, who you've been talking about here, and then Harry Truman that followed him, and President Eisenhower. Even though they're known most for the World War II era, their experiences were formulated largely with World War I in that period of time.
It's a very important distinction. And it was almost as if a new era was being ushered in 60 when Kennedy and Nixon ran against each other. There was Ike before that and Truman before that. These were World War II experiences. There was the age issue. Kennedy and Nixon were young. So it was not just the television and the radio and the whole business of electronic and a 24-hour-a-day news cycle as the old morning and evening news cycle. It was the technology, which I think is the only sovereignty in the world, that led us into this new world. And it was almost as if Nixon and Kennedy came out of central casting.
Interesting. And that's the wonderful way now to segue into 1960 and that historic presidential election as we were having the new generation, as President Kennedy said, after he's elected, the passing of the torch into a new generation. But covering the 1960 presidential election, as we had these two gentlemen who were in World War II and passing the torch, what was the 1960 election? How did you view that at that time? Did you see it?
A referendum on Catholicism.
A referendum on Catholicism, wow.
The last Catholic to run was Al Smith in 28. He was beaten by Herbert Hoover, because everybody thought control of the country would pass to the Pope. There was a story that went around, probably apocryphal, that said after the election, which Smith lost, he sent a one-word cable to the Pope in Rome. All it said was unpack. But that was the issue then. And a lot of the country in 1960 didn't know Kennedy was a Catholic. But anti-Catholicism had not gone away. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't really until the Houston Ministerial Association that occurred about a week before the first debate. And he went before these Protestant ministers and made the case that a Catholic can run the country without worrying about his religion and so forth. But it was an issue.
Did you cover both the national conventions in 1960?
I sure did.
So what's your memories of the conventions, what they were like at that time with Kennedy being nominated and Vice President Nixon?
Well, there was a lingering movement to nominate Adlai Stevens for a third term, for a third
candidacy, yeah.
And that just didn't go anywhere. And some others, Hubert Humphrey ran, and he only won 4 out of the 10 districts in Wisconsin, so the news said, well, he hasn't really conquered the Catholic issue. So it goes to West Virginia, which is hardly a Catholic state, and had much more money than Hubert Humphrey, and the aid of Franklin D. Roosevelt, Jr., and the name of Roosevelt in labor-ridden West Virginia. That was a big go for him, and then it was all over after that.
Well, then one of the most historic moments I think a lot of people view in your career and the modern American presidency was to have the first presidential debates held in the 20th century. And you were a panelist in the first debate, and that was a historic moment. And tell us how that came about and how your role came about and your recollections of that experience.
I know, I was covering Nixon at the time instead of Kennedy. I was in Mississippi, and they told me I'm to be the NBC representative in the debate. I got on a train. I think went from New Orleans to Chicago, and I got on somewhere in Mississippi. Went in the dining room. There was a lovely tablecloth and a rose, and I had dinner and wrote all my questions. Then that was a Saturday, and on Monday, the 4 panelists, no, it was on Sunday, we went into WBBM studio, which is a CBS affiliate, and Don Hewitt, who later went on to fame with 60 Minutes, was our producer.
Studio One was the backdrop for a presidential first, the televised Nixon-Kennedy debates in 1960.
We discussed tonight domestic issues.
I stand for programs that will mean growth and progress.
And all we did was sit in the chair, turn around to the audience, and say who we were.
The correspondents.
I'm Sander Vanocur, NBC News.
I'm Charles Warren, Mutual News.
I'm Stuart Novins, CBS News.
Bob Fleming, ABC News. The first question to Senator Kennedy from Mr. Fleming.
No instructions or anything like that. And we showed up then Monday night, about an hour before the debate took place, and the press was in a room. The press representative was permitted to go on. His name was Benjamin C. Bradley, who later went to fame with Washington Post. Sure. No audience. Nixon arrived first. We did not know he had banged his knee on the car door, a knee which he had injured and got infected in Georgia a couple of weeks before. But he was wearing a gray suit. Kennedy got there, he was wearing a dark suit. Now, we didn't know what it looked like, and people say, you were there. Nope. You didn't see it through television if you were on the panel. Uh-huh. We saw a little bit of sweat on Nixon's upper lip.
Whether we are moving ahead or not, we think only of what the federal government is doing.
And a tendency on Nixon's part to defer more to Kennedy than Kennedy did to Nixon.
Mr. Nixon, would you like to comment on that statement?
I have no comment.
But the debate was over, the place was cleared out, and most important, we didn't have what we have today, handlers, to come out there, and as Groucho Marx used to say, who are you going to believe, me or your lying eyes? We didn't see it on television, and the place was cleared out. And I called up the next day and reached him in California, a man named Abe Ribicoff, governor of Connecticut, first Democratic governor to come out for Kennedy, and he'd been riding in a car the night before, Sacramento to San Francisco. He heard it on radio. He thought Nixon had won. Now, Nixon did better in the next 3 debates, but it was the first one that acquainted Kennedy with a great number of people in this country who, if they knew anything about him, they knew he was young and he was a Catholic. But that was a great turning point, not just for that election, but I think for all elections thereafter, though there weren't any more debates on television until '76.
Mm-hmm. And for our audience, might refresh that was during the black and white TV era, no color, right?
Yeah, black and white, yeah. Exactly. And with our naked eyes, Nixon, you couldn't tell, but gray against gray, it doesn't work.
We're moving into the election night then. It's a close election, and Senator Kennedy prevails in a close election over Vice President Nixon. We move into the new era with the Kennedy presidency. You were the White House correspondent then, as I recall.
There were 2 of us. My colleague, now gone, wonderful man named Ray Scheer, who covered Eisenhower. And because NBC had just gotten 2 5-minute shows sponsored by General Mills, one at 11:25 in the morning, one at 4:25, Ray would stay out at the studio until he'd done the 11:25. I would finish up, take a source to lunch, and then go out and do the 4:25. So there were 2 of us. And Kennedy was very diffident about television. I remember at a party at the home of his son-in-law, Sarge Shriver in Chicago, who was married to Eunice Kennedy, and he ran the merchandise mart, which the old man owned. And Joe Kennedy came up to me and introduced himself and said, Vanocur, I've been watching you on television. You're doing a good job. I keep telling Jack, forget the press. It's you guys who are the future. But I must say, Kennedy was a little diffident about the media until television, until after the first debate, and he was still a little cautious about it. He was more of a print guy.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting. So it was Joe Kennedy, his father, who saw then the shift to you guys and the
the
TV.
old man had also been in Hollywood in the late 20s, so he had some visual experience.
Yes. Going into the Kennedy presidency, one of the most remembered things was the Cuban Missile Crisis and how close we came to actually going to war with the Soviet Union. You were White House correspondent then. Tell us about your recollections covering that situation.
Well, he had failed, of course, on the Bay of Pigs, which was a plan handed over to him by the Republicans, and he carried it out, and it was a disaster. So when the Cuban Missile Crisis came along, the president made the speech on a Monday night, and I went home, and my late wife said, is there going to be a war? I said, I need a drink.
I have directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. To halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba, from whatever nation or port, will, if found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons, be turned back. It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union.
She got me a vodka on the rocks. The doorbell rang. I went downstairs, a Western Union wire. I brought it up, put it on the table, and she said, aren't you going to open it? I opened it, read it. I said to her, there's not going to be a war. She said, is that in the wire? I said, no. That's an invitation from Eunice Shriver for us to come to a dinner for the Duke and Duchess of Devonshire on Saturday night, and Eunice would never allow World War III to interfere. But it was a scary moment. Later, I went down to Cuba when they had an anniversary of the missile crisis, and I listened to the Russians and the Cubans, and it was very scary. But you see, on Saturday morning, Kennedy received a conciliatory cable, a bellicose cable, how to answer it. He chose to answer the conciliatory.
We're just going to take a brief pause here and then come back to the interview with Mr. Sander Vanocur.
Stinging insects send over 500,000 people to the hospital every year. I don't like hospitals. Rodents, like mice, contaminate food and transmit disease.
Cockroaches spread 33 kinds of bacteria, 6 parasitic worms, and can trigger asthma. That can't be good.
Pests are anything but child's play. Protect your little scientist by getting the facts at pestworld.org.
Senator, going back to that period of time, too, now, it's my recollection from everything that I've read that a colleague of yours played a role there in helping to break some of the ice, and that was John Scali, that there was some contact with him from a Soviet KGB agent, as I recall. Do you have any?
Yes, John Scali had been at the AP, then he came to work for ABC. And he, though we didn't know it at the time, had been used in the best sense of the word by the Russians and the Americans as a convoy to take messages back and forth. And I think he deserves a lot of credit for us not getting involved any deeper than we did.
Mm-hmm. Before we leave that the Kennedy presidency, we go into, of course, the most tragic moment of all, and that's the November 22nd, 1963. Where were you at the time when...
I was in Los Angeles. I'd been told by the management of NBC that they wanted me to go out and be the speaker at a dinner that Tom Sarno, General Sarno's son, he ran the West Coast, NBC, was hosting, where Danny Kaye was getting Humanitarian of the Year. So I went out there. And I got the word like everybody else around the middle of the morning in Los Angeles. I got on a plane, went back to Dallas. His body was gone. And then I kept going back, and then I reported that weekend. But I don't think we had any idea of the implications of this tragedy. We just never, nobody was going to compare it to Lincoln. He's sitting there, excuse me, in Dallas, and he's shot.
Going back with the assassination of President Kennedy, then Vice President Johnson is our new president, and what your impressions were at that time as Lyndon Johnson moved into the presidency and took charge?
Well, you couldn't have a greater contrast than the one between Johnson and Kennedy. And I remember standing in a little driveway between the old State Department building and the White House, and I first noticed Kennedy's rocking chair being taken out. About 5 minutes later, Lyndon Johnson's saddle with a holster coming in. And I can't remember a more visual definition of the difference.
I remember one moment I walked outside and went down in the alleyway along the West Wing. And as I was standing there, they were bringing Kennedy's chair, his rocking chair, out. This was Saturday morning. It was the rain. And a few minutes later, they came from the EOB with a saddle on a mount, which obviously belonged to Lyndon Johnson. Well, power changes very quickly and very brutally in Washington. And I'll never forget the exchange of those two pieces of furniture within a 20-minute period, and life goes on.
And I feel sorry for President Johnson, because he had some good things on the agenda. But he was a man of Congress in a way that Kennedy wasn't. He really thought he could do things that he did in the Great Society, and I don't think we benefited greatly from it.
History decides for this generation the choice must be our own. Even now, a rocket moves toward Mars. It reminds us that the world will not be the same for our children or even for ourselves in a short span of years.
And he got caught up in the war. Now, however, you must say, when Eisenhower left office, there were 900 so-called advisors in Vietnam. When Kennedy was killed, there were 19,000, and then it was nowhere after that, because Lyndon Johnson had this idea he didn't want to be the first president to lose a country in Asia, because we were still caught up in who lost China.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that, going into 1964, you covered both conventions then, I assume.
Yeah.
And the Republicans were in San Francisco, and the Democrats were in
Atlantic City.
Atlantic City, okay. So you had Barry Goldwater pulling off the nomination, which was considered a rather dramatic move at that time. And that 1964 Republican convention was a very passionate one, shall I say. What's your memories of that convention in particular?
Not be made fuzzy and futile by unthinking and stupid labels.
Memory is that this was a turning point in the history of the Republican Party, because what Barry Goldwater had done was to take his party by defeating Roosevelt. It was my view that Goldwater had taken the party across the Mississippi, and Rockefeller was part of the Eastern establishment, and he didn't get across. And this was a great turning point, and the press was not very well liked. John Chancellor was whisked off the floor by the guards, and it was just a change in the Republican Party, and probably interesting that it was done in San Francisco.
Yeah. Yes, and I know you're friends with Governor Scranton, who replaced Governor Rockefeller at the end there. And
I told him at the Muehlebach Hotel in February of 1964, Rockefeller's not going to make it, and the party, the Eastern so-called establishment, is going to make you run. He didn't want to, but he did, and there was no contest.
Yes. 1964, same time as the Republican Convention, there's an incident called the Gulf of Tonkin that became sort of the casus belli, I guess you might call it, for our involvement in Vietnam. Did you have a sense at that time what the Gulf of Tonkin might mean?
Yes, I did, because it only received there were 2 negative votes in the whole Senate. And Gaylord Nelson, a progressive Democrat from Wisconsin, was against the resolution. He went to Mike Mansfield and he assured Gaylord that this would not change our policy. And he regretted all the time afterward that he voted for the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, because it wasn't what it appeared to be.
Mm-hmm.
But it launched us into the war.
Then in October of that year, just before the election, they have the free speech movement in Berkeley, and it catalyzes the radical movement. So we have the entrance going into Vietnam War. We have a radical movement that's being birthed on college campuses around the country. And then just prior to the election in 1964, as some people have said, the only positive thing happened in the Goldwater campaign was an actor with Death Valley Days gave a talk for Barry Goldwater. It was on TV, named Ronald Reagan. So with those activities taking place, free speech movement, number one, because you talked about Vietnam here, any sense at that time how historic that would be at that time and how much that would set campuses on fire?
I never thought it was that historic. What I thought it was all about is the sons of the white middle class were not being drafted, and poor whites and poor blacks were. And I think that that's what started it. And you could see by the way people dressed over the years coming up, when they marched down Pennsylvania Avenue, that this was a middle-class protest that is not at all like what we have today with Occupy Wall Street.
Mm-hmm.
It was class just as it was at the '68 convention in Chicago.
And that's a beautiful way to move on to 1968, looking at that presidential election, and Lyndon Johnson making a surprise announcement in the spring that year that he was not going to seek re-election, and then Vice President Humphrey with the nomination, and then former Vice President Richard Nixon, and then the convention in Chicago. You were there?
I was there, and it's not generally known, but I learned this from Kenny O'Donnell, now deceased, a Kennedy aide, very fine person, that Mayor Daley was against the war.
Interesting.
But Mayor Daley was against the war because who were they drafting? Poor whites, poor blacks from the south side and the west side. But then, when they burst out of the hotels and went across Grant Park, Mayor Daley switched because they were destroying his beautiful city that he had created. And then on the floor, Dan Rather was slugged. And I think Lyndon Johnson was perfectly ready to pull the plug on Hubert Humphrey because the platform committee, he wanted an endorsement of the war. And a lot of people, like Abe Ribicoff, the governor of, he was then gone to BHEW, he was against it. And Mayor Daley didn't like it, and neither did Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson really believed in that war.
Mm-hmm. When you reference 50s about civil rights and the Cold War being dominant issues, in 1962, Medgar Evers was murdered in Mississippi, and then now we're in 1968, and then, of course, you have the tragic assassination of Martin Luther King and then Robert Kennedy. So it was a very painful period of time for the country, and the convention in Chicago with the Democrats was turned violent. And tell us about that whole period, 1968. You did an interview with Robert Kennedy the day before he was assassinated.
The night before.
The night before.
Well, actually, it was about 2 hours before. I interviewed him in his room at the Ambassador Hotel.
Mm-hmm.
That was a great change in the war, the assassinations. it changed dramatically the way news was received and perceived. We had really entered what I call the celluloid age.
Now, you covered from the Ambassador Hotel, as from what I understand, live almost the full night, the story of the assassination.
Yeah, went back on the same plane with his body.
Yes. And with that period of time, with these assassinations, I can remember my father saying to me that all hell was breaking loose. And here we're in the Vietnam War is in such a difficult shape, and the controversy, the assassinations. Did you have fears about the future of our country and at that time, or did you have some confidence that we would work our way through it?
I've never had fears about my country. What I was worried about, though, was this marriage of demonstrators and the new age of television, and that didn't represent the country I knew and covered in that period. I was sad about it, I was mad about it, but I didn't think it would destroy the country. And of course, what it led us to was Richard Nixon, and then what followed was Watergate, and the enemies list of which I was on.
Well, now as we're onto that subject, you're still covering the White House, 1968?
Oh, no. I was long gone, and I had a Saturday night show of news, and I did the morning show, the Today Show. No, it was just a changed world for me.
Okay. Now, with Richard Nixon, did you have suspicions? He always had a difficult time in the press. He had his enemies list. You were on it. Did you have a sense of what might be forthcoming with the difficulties?
No, I didn't. I was sure that he would continue to follow Johnson's line on Vietnam, though he did start the Who Lost China end, because though he had been very much involved in pro-nationalist China, he did send Kissinger to prepare the way for him to go to China. So it was a mix-up. The peace talks continued over Vietnam and Paris. They didn't work out very well. And his domestic programs were rather good. My dear friend Pat Moynihan worked for him, and he said he was very thoughtful on these issues, which he was.
Now, you mentioned Pat Moynihan, later Senator Moynihan. Now, again, how did your friendship develop with Pat Moynihan?
We were classmates, graduate students of the London School of Economics, and it was a time when America was being berated for crossing over the line in Korea and expanding the war and so forth. And we're getting hell from the Indian graduate students. We didn't want to take it anymore. The food was terrible at school, so we walked across the Strand to India House, where the food was no better, but it was so spicy you couldn't taste it. So, and then Pat and I roomed together, and then I went off to Germany, and he went home afterward, and then he worked for Averell Harriman, the governor in New York, and then he ran for the Senate and served 4 very productive terms.
You know, when you reference Richard Nixon, of course, with every president, there's good things and bad things that happened during their presidencies. And so with Nixon, though, when the Watergate story first broke, was there any sense of how serious this would become at that time?
In the summer of 1972.
Tell you what, we're going to take a brief pause right here,
okay,
and then we're going to come back as you go back to the summer of 1972, right?
Yeah.
Okay, then we'll get there.
Green, green, green. It's your home, it's your dream. Radon testing, keep it healthy and clean. Make it green, green, green. Making it green is making sure the air in your home is healthy for your family to breathe. Make sure you test your home for the presence of radon. It's easy. To learn more, call 866-730-GREEN. Preserve your family's health and well-being. Get your home tested. Now that's living healthy and green. Green, green, green. It's your home, it's your dream. Radon testing, keep it healthy and clean. Make it green, green, green. To learn more, call 866-730-GREEN.
Thank you. We're going back to 1972, Sander, and with the Watergate break-in as the story was breaking, and you were giving us your recollections at that time.
Well, in the summer of '72, and somebody has documented this, of all the reporters in Washington, there were only 8 working on the Watergate story. 4 of them were from the Washington Post, Woodward and Bernstein, of course, and then 2 police reporters who had started this whole thing. And it was estimated there were 8 people in the press working on it. And I took Ben Bradley, the editor, to lunch right after Thanksgiving, and he just looked ashen. I said, what? He said, we haven't got a break in this story. And everybody was saying, and some hoping, that the Washington Post would fall on its face. And the Attorney General, who later had to resign, Nixon's, said Katharine Graham, forgive me for saying this, has caught her tit in a wringer. And it wasn't until much afterward that it caught on with the hearings on the Hill with Sam Ervin. But why Nixon did it, I'll never know, except he was paranoid.
Richard Nixon's reelected in 1972 in landslide. George McGovern,
Yes.
his opponent. You covered probably both conventions in 1972. And Nixon wins in a landslide. And what's your recollection of those conventions? Miami, and I'm forgetting the other location it was at. The Republicans were in Miami, weren't they?
Yeah, can't remember where the Democrats were.
I, Richard Nixon, do solemnly swear
that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
Inauguration Day, 1973. For Richard Nixon, perhaps the pinnacle moment of his long political career. On Election Day, voters returned Nixon to office with one of the most overwhelming majorities in presidential history, all but completely ignoring a story that quietly broke just 6 months earlier.
I don't have much of a memory of it all. I didn't think McGovern had a chance. And then it all collapsed on Nixon shortly afterward. And the country was very, very lucky that a vice president was named Gerald Ford.
With that said, 1970 Watergate occurs, and the break-in, and then as the story's evolving, eventually the Senate hearings, and then and leading to Nixon's resignation. Prior to then, however, Vice President Spiro Agnew resigns.
I believe that America has always thrived on adversity, and so I can foresee only good ahead for this country, despite my personal sorrow at leaving public service and leaving many objectives incomplete. Under this administration which you have chosen and in which I have been privileged to serve, the longest war in America's history has been brought to an honorable end. And we are within the best chance for lasting peace that the world has had in a century and a half. Both the abundance and the quality of American life are pushing to new highs. The resignation of a vice president, for example, is insignificant compared with the death of a president, particularly one so great as Lincoln.
And then we have, a year later, President Nixon's resignation, and we have the Vietnam War, still the difficulty of trying to find our way out of that.
After months of investigation and congressional hearings about the Watergate break-in, Americans stopped what they were doing on August 8, 1974, to stare at their TV sets and watch the first President of the United States resign his office.
Good evening.
This is the 37th time I have spoken to you from this office, where so many decisions have been made that shape the history of this nation. Each time I have done so to discuss with you some matter that I believe affected the national interest. In all the decisions I have made in my public life, I have always tried to do what was best for the nation. Throughout the long and difficult period of Watergate, I have felt it was my duty to persevere, to make every possible effort to complete the term of office to which you elected me. In the past few days, however, it has become evident to me that I no longer have a strong enough political base in the Congress to justify continuing that effort.
Gerald Ford walks into the presidency then under a very difficult period of time, and one of the first things he does is pardons Richard Nixon.
Finally, I feel that Richard Nixon and his loved ones have suffered enough and will continue to suffer no matter what I do, no matter what we, as a great and good nation, can do together to make his goal of peace come true. Now, therefore, I, Gerald R. Ford, President of the United States, pursuant to the pardon power conferred upon me by Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution, have granted, and by these presents do grant, a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon for all offenses against the United States which he, Richard Nixon, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from July 20, 1969 through August 9, 1974.
How was that covered at the time? And
covered as it should have been. That Nixon really didn't have an option. Sorry.
Ford.
It was covered as it should have been. Ford had no option except to get on with history, and people forgot about it. But Ford was a good president. One of the few people I've ever covered in Washington who knew who he was as a human being and was at peace with himself. I've seen in my lifetime one Ford, and the other was Ronald Reagan.
Mm-hmm. With Ford coming into, and I remember I watched several years ago when President Ford, before he passed, was given the Kennedy Award for the Valor of Courage. And Caroline Kennedy was there, and former President Clinton was there. And they spoke with genuineness, and President Clinton, I felt, spoke very articulately, saying, and he looked at President Ford and said how angry he was when President Ford had did that. Now, many years later, and after Clinton left the presidency, he recognized what a profile in courage it was, and the fact that Ford made that decision probably cost him the presidency right there, virtually.
I think it did. Now, there was a man in the Congress, a colleague from Wisconsin, who I think is possibly the smartest politician I ever covered. His name is Melvin Laird. He was Secretary of Defense after Congress. And I think that probably was a great influence. I don't know how much advice he got or gave, and but I think he was lucky he was there, and I think it was unfortunate that President Ford, maybe it was the timing on a weekend, and that's sometimes the only time when you have coups in Latin America, weekends. But Hitler did the same thing on weekends against Chamberlain and so forth for World War II. But I just think President Ford was at peace with himself, just the way Reagan was. And a lot of presidents are not, and we suffer from it.
It's interesting. So going into the last portion of this first interview with you. Going into 1976, President Ford is seeking re-election. Governor Carter from Georgia is nominated to run against him. And the Kennedy-Nixon debates were the first in the 20th century, and then we didn't have any other debates until 1976. And the debates, some people say, also may have cost President Ford re-election because of a comment he made about Poland not being under the sphere of influence.
That's right. I was there when it happened. There was a hush. I think the lights went out, too, during that debate.
Really?
Mr. President, I'd like to explore a little more deeply our relationship with the Russians. Our allies in France and Italy are now flirting with communism. We've recognized a permanent communist regime in East Germany. We've virtually signed in Helsinki an agreement that the Russians have dominance in Eastern Europe.
I'm glad you raised it, Mr. Frankel. In the case of Helsinki, 35 nations signed an agreement, including the Secretary of State for the Vatican. I can't under any circumstances believe that His Holiness the Pope would agree by signing that agreement that the 35 nations have turned over to the Warsaw Pact nations the domination of Eastern Europe. It just isn't true. There is no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and there never will be under a Ford administration.
I'm sorry, could I just follow? Did I understand you to say, sir, that the Russians are not using Eastern Europe as their own sphere of influence and occupying most of the countries there and making sure with their troops that it's a communist zone?
I don't believe, Mr. Frankel, that the Yugoslavians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Romanians consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. I don't believe that the Poles consider themselves dominated by the Soviet Union. Each of those countries is independent, autonomous. It has its own territorial integrity. And the United States does not concede that those countries are under the domination of the Soviet Union.
And it was an unfortunate mistake, and he paid dearly for it. But I think we owe him a gratitude for getting us through Watergate.
Mm-hmm. Jimmy Carter becomes president. Did you cover those conventions as well in the presidential election that year? Was Carter a surprise in getting the nomination that year and the presidency, do you feel, or did you see it coming?
Well, it wasn't much of a surprise, but I think he was a disaster. I remember after he left, I was in the studio with Jim Wooten, me, and Frank Reynolds was the moderator. He said, "Gentlemen, Jimmy Carter's greatest achievement." And Jim said, "Camp David." And I said, "He induced in the hearts and minds of his countrymen a sense of impotence about the management of their affairs at home and abroad." Malaise.
Yes. But now that you've given us your view on the Carter presidency, I'm going to go back a little bit backwards and just see if I can get, before we close this portion, your views on some of the other presidents. So you've made comments about covering the other presidents. So you've already offered your view of President Carter's presidency. So going back, and you've basically given President Ford pretty decent remarks as a man who was comfortable with himself during a very difficult period of time. So we'll go before Ford then, and add a little bit more on Richard Nixon. He's still a mystery to a lot of us.
He's a mystery to himself.
Mystery to himself.
You ever see the picture of him walking on the beach in those black shoes? He was the most ungainly person I've ever seen in terms of when he walked or hitting a golf ball, and smart, but lacking in confidence in himself, and if I may say, lacking a bit of confidence in the American people.
Interesting observation. Going then before Richard Nixon, with Lyndon Johnson and his performance as presidency after he replaced President Kennedy.
He was ruined by Vietnam.
He was ruined by Vietnam.
Yeah. And I think the Great Society was too much. I think more should have been left to the private sector.
Now, when you talk about the civil rights movement in the 50s and how the Cold War dominated the issues, Lyndon Johnson became known as the great civil rights president of our time. How did that come about? Because his record before then was rather ambiguous on civil rights.
Well, it was ambiguous because he was in the Senate and he had to juggle a lot of differing views. When you're president of the United States, you can put out this mandate and people either obey it or they don't, and he succeeded. And maybe he was helped in the succession because of Dr. King, who was not yet dead, and the marches in Washington. And I think one of the most important events was Martin Luther King at the Lincoln Memorial.
1964, right?
Yeah.
What can you share about your observations for the less than 3 years that President Kennedy served during that period of time?
I think the one thing that's overlooked is the economic aspect. When he came into office, I think the highest rate was 92%, and the budget deficit was minuscule. Walter Heller, as chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, urged him to take it down to 70%, but he didn't do it. He didn't live long enough to do it. I just think there were no major achievements as such, maybe the nuclear test ban treaty, but simply because he was making a transition from the Truman-Eisenhower period, and it wasn't easy to do bold things. And John F. Kennedy, he wasn't bold, he wasn't reckless, but he was very careful.
Then we'll go back during when your career was really birthed, the Eisenhower era. Looking back at Eisenhower, how do you view his presidency and his performance?
I view it very well because he achieved some kind of rapprochement with the Soviet Union. He steadied the economy, and he was almost a father figure to the American people at a time when that was just what we wanted.
Then Harry Truman, the unexpected president when Franklin Delano Roosevelt passed away. When he left office in 1952, he was an unpopular president. Now he's viewed as a very good, if not great, president.
I thought he was a wonderful president, desegregated the armed forces. Couple of memorable lines. If you want a friend in Washington, get a dog. And on the Saturday after Kennedy's inauguration, he and Mrs. Kennedy invited President Truman to the White House, which he had not been invited to for 8 years. Later on, we were at the Mayflower Hotel. Kennedy was going in to speak to the Democratic National Committee, and one of us said, "Did President Truman see any major changes in the White House since he left?" He said, "Yes." He said, referring to Eisenhower, "The son of a bitch moved my piano to the basement."
And prior to Truman then, during the Depression, then with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, you referenced earlier about his father figure, the excellent use he made of his voice and the radio, the impact that radio had on the country at that time. Looking back retrospectively on the presidency of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
I think it was necessary, it was brilliant, and being a Midwesterner, I lived through that period of isolationism that did not exactly prepare us for World War II. But what he gave the country was a sense of confidence in itself that we hadn't had before. And I must say, his wife did a lot of good things too. Eleanor Roosevelt. I don't think they talk to each other much.
Maybe that's the key to a good marriage.
Yeah, long separations.
What we're going to do as we end this first portion of this interview, and we're talking about Franklin Roosevelt and the use of radio there, and want to explore more in our second interview that transition from radio to television, and then also where we're at now as we're moving into the internet age, so to speak, and these transitions in the way information flows, how it's gathered, and how it's reported. And looking back on the years that we've talked about now, going up to 1980, any particular final observations you want to add on those years before we take a break and move on to the second interview?
Yes. There was no hint that Prohibition would return.
And thank goodness for that. Well, with that, Sander, this has been a wonderful...
You'll drink to that?
I'll drink to that any time. And you and I have enjoyed a number of visits with some good wine. So we're going to bring this first portion of this interview to a conclusion, and then going to come back and do a second interview in a little while. And it's been always a pleasure, Sander. And you've been a great asset to this country, too. I'd probably never have shared that.
Did you tell that to
I'm going to tell
Nixon?
that. I'm going to share it with your wife, too.
Okay. She will buy it.
Thank you very much, Sander.